Welcome to Ask the Expert, an award-winning daily series from 8:30 a.m. to 9 a.m. to help small businesses. If you have any questions, ask them in the comments of the live feed. If you need any more advice, join the official Intuit QuickBooks SMB community group on Facebook. Accountants and business experts are on hand 24/7. During the live session, we'll be running a poll, so please do engage with it and I'll reveal the results at the end. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Lynn. I am the executive chairman and co-founder of a business called Cedars. We are what has come to be known as an equity crowdfunding platform. What we do is we give small businesses the opportunity to raise equity capital from a wide range of individual, institutional, and other types of investors, all through a very simple online process. And in turn, we let investors ranging from £10 all the way up to hundreds of thousands of pounds, discover and invest in businesses that they believe in. We set up the business, initially started working on it back in 2009. We've been live since 2012. The gap between those two was a very long regulatory approval. We were the first business anywhere in the world of our kind to get regulated to do what we do. And so we've been going now for just short of 9 years. We've seen over £1 billion invested through the platform across about 1,300 deals. And we participated in funding rounds of many wonderful businesses ranging from big, well-known unicorns like Revolut, or what have become big, well-known unicorns. It was a much smaller company at the time, all the way down to some wonderful small seed stage businesses cross-sector and cross-geography. I'm going to talk briefly this morning about what it is that equity crowdfunding is and a couple of the developments that we see in the space for those of you who are familiar with it. Before I do, I just want to say at the outset, I apologize. I've got a rather nasty cold this morning, and so if I get into a coughing fit, I promise it's not COVID. Not that it matters when we're online, but it is just a cold. But if I get into a coughing fit or something, that's what that is. And if I start saying things that make absolutely no sense, you can blame it on the cold as well, even if I probably would have said the same things when feeling well. So crowdfunding. One of the things that was sort of a surprise to me as the years have gone by is that this term crowdfunding even took on its own special meaning. And what I mean by that is that when my co-founder Carlos Silva and I set out to build this business, we looked at what was really quite an established form of financing, which is investing equity in small businesses. Now, you could say that modern venture capital and modern angel investing maybe only dates, here in Britain to the 90s, and the US maybe to the 60s. But in reality, investing in the equity of speculative ventures, where there's a high risk that you will lose your investment, but if the venture is successful, it can return a many times multiple. I mean, that goes back to the days of the seafaring explorers, and actually, venture capital is a derivation of the concept of adventure capital. Somebody would invest in a ship, and odds were that the ship would sink or come back without a whole lot of value. But if it came back with great spices or treasures, then all the investors would get wealthy. So the principle behind this type of investment, although it's not a very well-known type of investing, it's a little bit of a corner of the capital markets. The principle is centuries old. But what we wanted to do was take that principle and move it online and make it possible for businesses of all shapes and stripes to be able to raise capital from as wide a community as possible. Because in an offline world, it is often highly, businesses' success in raising equity capital is often highly dependent on personal networks, often highly dependent on an ability to reach the right venture capital firm at the right time. Whereas we felt that in an online world where you were getting a whole lot of potential investors looking at your business at any one time, and you could agglomerate small investments from a lot of them, it would be easier for businesses to raise capital at a fair price. And then on the flip side, we felt for investors, there was no reason you should have to be fabulously wealthy to make these kinds of investments. I mean, historically, the types of people who invest in small businesses have been what are known as angel investors, or else professional venture capitalists. And usually, that requires a huge amount of money to build a portfolio. By some estimates, I mean, the way we've estimated it is to be an angel investor, you really need at least £5 million of investable capital, at your disposal, and probably more. And so we said, this is silly. And frankly, Carlos and I saw ourselves as two prime candidates on the investor side. We were about 30 at the time we started setting the business up. We both had brief professional careers so far. We weren't in a position to make 20 investments of 25 or 50,000 pounds each. But the notion of making a number of investments at 100 pounds or 250 pounds or something like that was very appealing to us. And so we thought this would be a great opportunity for investors as well. And fundamentally, that is all that we're doing. We are bringing together businesses seeking capital and investors that are raising capital. Now, that's the simple and conceptual level. The harder question, and for those small businesses or small business owners running, listening this morning, the question is, okay, well, how do you make online fundraising or crowdfunding work for you? And I think there are essentially two key points that we always emphasize. Every business is different. There's no single golden ticket, but across 1,300 or so funded deals and almost 9 years of experience, we've seen two kind of core principles. The one, which is a basic one, and this would apply in any form of equity fundraising, is there needs to be a compelling equity story. There needs to be an answer to the question, what if it all succeeds? And that answer has to be compelling. I mean, all early stage businesses have a lot of risk associated with them, some more than others. But that risk has to be compensated by reward. And where equity funding works well, including equity crowdfunding, is where the potential for the business to really get quite significant in size, to really get to a point where investors can achieve a multiple return on their capital. That's really where equity investors become interested. And there's a terrible tendency within the kind of venture capital and tech generally landscape to be a bit pejorative about businesses that are different from that. Oh, you're just running a lifestyle business. Oh, you're just running a small business to make a living. And I think that's absolute nonsense. I think that it is wonderful, and I have huge admiration for, and sometimes a degree of envy for, people who run profitable, day in, day out businesses that make a good living for their owners and their employees. It's just that those businesses tend not to have an equity story behind them, tend not to be equity fundable, and they usually, that's where debt often comes in, or other forms of financing. So the equity story is key. The second bit, which is probably more unique to online fundraising, is about community. It's about getting as many people behind your business as possible, excited about your business, and wanting to invest in it, because that's the community that builds momentum. We've got, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of investors sitting on our platform looking at interesting deals, but not a single one of them, or virtually none of them, will go into a deal that's 0% funded. And part of it's just basic human psychology, that nobody goes into the empty bar or the empty restaurant. But it's also in no small part a very fair validation, which is that if they want to see that you can get your friends, your family, your community behind you in order to be able to in order to show that there's at least some level of interest in what you're doing, and that the people who know you, know your product, know your business, are interested in what you're doing. So community is very important. Now, community can come from a whole bunch of different ways, and I think there's often a perception that it's all about getting one big angel or one big anchor investor in, and that helps in its own way. But more important, I think, is about, and what we've seen through the years, is about trying to build a bit of a following around the business. And that doesn't necessarily mean a huge customer base. That doesn't necessarily mean, a locked-in following. It can simply be a newsletter list, whereas you start building your business up, you're sharing with people information about how it's developing. It can be through building a little bit of a social media following. It can be almost anything that gets people interested in and engaged in what you're doing, because those are going to be your core investors. Those are going to be the people who come in first and begin to build momentum around the round. And then once you have that kind of momentum, what we then see is that all of our investors start looking and start saying, oh, this is really interesting. I'd like to come into this as well. Um, and that's how big deals get funded, and that's how we get to a high success rate. We have gotten very good, without wanting to be immodest, as a platform, about being able to assess ahead of time whether, based on your community and your equity story and the other features of what you're doing, we think you're likely to succeed. So when we first started out, maybe 20-30% of businesses that we put on the platform would hit their targets. Now it's well over 90%. So for the most part, if you come and you engage with us, we tend to be able to say, yeah, we think this will work, or no, we really don't think this will work. So it's a pretty, hopefully, pain-free experience in the sense that you don't go through all the work without being able to successfully raise money. So that, in a very, very, very brief nutshell, is a little bit about raising capital. I'm going to say one final bit, and then we can move on to questions, which is that a really interesting development on our end, and what we're seeing more generally in the space, is the advent of secondaries. And secondaries are when, instead of the company raising capital for itself, existing shareholders sell their shares to new shareholders. We have a secondary market on our platform, which we launched on a very simple basis back in 2017. It's become hugely popular. And now we're starting to do individual secondary campaigns where businesses can actually raise capital to buy out existing shareholders rather than just to take new money in. And we're seeing across the space a lot of interest as businesses grow, may not want to exit yet, may not want to IPO, but want to take advantage of secondary liquidity. And we're having an opportunity to facilitate that, to a greater degree than I think we anticipated we would be able to. Secondaries in private capital, secondaries in private companies have historically been very tough for a whole number of reasons. But I think we have, again, without wanting to sound too immodest, I think we've done a pretty good job of doing that. Our secondary market now trades about £1 million of shares a month. We're starting to do more and more secondary campaigns, and I think that if you are a business that is getting to that stage where you think you might like to take a little bit off the table, where you've grown, where the business is doing well, and you're at that stage, we'd love to talk to you as well about whether we can potentially help with that. So I think we're probably just about at 10 minutes, and I don't want to keep rambling on because I'd much rather take questions. So I think I'm going to go ahead and start doing that. And the first one I've got here is Isidore, who's come in on Facebook Messenger. It says, what are your top tips to business owners to get the desired funds raised through crowdfunding? How important is marketing and PR in creating the right amount of buzz? So that's a really good question, and that's where, to some degree, this community point comes in. Marketing and PR are super important, but they're a tool rather than a sort of end. It's not just about splashing the name of the business, in every which place. It is, but what those things do is they tend to be pretty good about activating and attracting a community around the business. So sometimes the marketing that comes from a campaign or PR that comes from a campaign actually starts to get people interested, or maybe somebody's heard of the business before, and then this is a further touch point that gets them drawn further in. So it works hand in hand with other forms of community building. I don't particularly think that this is a space, this isn't selling toothpaste in the sense that you can just sort of put an ad out there of some form and people buy, but it does a great reinforcing job. And when you start getting multiple touch points with people, that's when they start to become interested in investing. Next question, Savitri, I hope I pronounced that right, from a Twitter DM. What's the difference between product crowdfunding and equity crowdfunding? So that's a really, really, really good question. And this is one of the weird things about the term crowdfunding, is that it can be used to apply to a bunch of different things. Product crowdfunding, which is probably best known with platforms like Kickstarter and Indiegogo, is all about raising money to build a particular product. And from the funder's perspective, there is no financial return. And from the funded business's perspective, there's no equity issuance. So what's basically happening, the way I always put it fairly simply, and I should say I love Kickstarter, I love Indiegogo, I love product crowdfunding. But what it basically is I want to make a cool new watch. So I'm going to ask you to give a bunch of money, to help me make that watch. And if you give £100, then I'll send you a watch when it's ready. And so it's basically a form almost of pre-purchasing. And it works very well, particularly for unusual products, unusual physical products, hardware type things. Probably one of the most notable, or successful, or high profile at least, product crowdfunding campaigns in early days was the Oculus, the VR headset, and that's the kind of thing that often works very well. Obviously, there are a lot of more niche things there that can be successful, but it very much is a commercial rather than an investment transaction. It's very much about raising money for a specific product. The person putting that money forward is buying the product. Whereas with equity crowdfunding, it's an investment form, just like any other investment. I'm putting money into the capital of a business. I'm holding shares in that business, and then I'm hoping for a return on those shares. And I would say that I think that, and this will get get into a slightly later question as well, but I would say that I think that what we do at equity crowdfunding works more broadly across a lot of different sectors. I think I think product crowdfunding is more tailored, again, to sort of kind of cool, innovative hardware products usually, whereas equity crowdfunding really can facilitate investment for any business with a compelling equity story. So next we've got Hans from a DM on Instagram. Good morning. What entrepreneurial tricks have you discovered to keep you focused and productive in your day-to-day busy schedule? I smirk at that because I'm probably the worst person to ask. I co-founded the company. I was CEO for about 8 years, and then I hired my own replacement and moved into the executive chairman role. And I did so in part because I think the huge amount of juggling that is required as a CEO to be able to jump from one thing to the next is not something that I was really very good at. I tend to like to create. I like to build things. I like to think, in some depth about, how to do things. And I find that the many challenges of a sort of busy entrepreneurial lifestyle are not something that are hugely compatible with me. And I don't say that with any pride. I wish I were better at it. I mean, our CEO, I look at him and I look at his diary, and it's sort of chock full all day. And, he just jumps from one thing to another and is able to switch his attention so quickly. And I think it's a heck of a skill to have. I think it's, and I'm sure there are great techniques. And I think you have to ask somebody who's been better at figuring out those techniques than I have. Moving swiftly along, Hartwin, also an Instagram DM. What type of industries companies generally do well in crowdfunding campaigns? So, great question. This is a very is a very wide range space, in the sense that we have something like 17 or 18 official sectors, ranging from from sort of automotive and transport to fintech to SaaS to travel and leisure, and we see a huge amount of activity in all of them. I think no one sector dominates. I think last I saw, no one sector accounted for more than about 12% of all of our businesses. And so really any sort of business, again, compelling equity story and decent community can do well. And one of the myths often I think about equity crowdfunding is that it's only for B2C businesses. Actually, we do hugely well with B2B as well. The key with B2B is that it has to be a story, it has to be a business that can be explained online, to a pretty wide range of sort of, educated lay people. And so if you're doing some very complicated, SAP integration or implementation within, very large FTSE 100 businesses, that's probably not going to work so well because it's too specialized. But the number of B2B plays that we've had that are fundamentally focused on small businesses, that are fundamentally focused on problems that sort of general business people and others kind of can understand, those can do absolutely great. Now, within that, we see different sectors get hung from time to time. So a few years ago, and still to this day to an extent, but a few years ago, fintech was all the rage. And really, we just, we could not put enough fintechs on the platform, and everything was getting funded. And excitingly, for many of us, in the last couple of years, last maybe year or two, sustainability-related businesses have been really, really big. And we see a lot of people really wanting to invest in businesses that are for profit, but by the nature of what they're doing, are trying to create a more sustainable world, and that may range everything from renewable energy businesses to recycled products to vegan foods and others. So we're seeing a lot of appetite there, but we continue to see businesses across the spectrum. I mean, we have not delved particularly ourselves into the crypto space. We think that for various reasons that's something different and not really an area that we're all that keen on, as a platform. But we're happy to fund crypto businesses, and are the most active, biggest funding round we have on the platform right now is for a new crypto bank, which seems to be going very well. So you really have the widest range. All right, moving on. Yolanda from Facebook Messenger says, "How has the pandemic affected the community in Cedars? Have you seen any positive trends since the pandemic hit?" Yeah, very much. I think that from an investor perspective, the pandemic has probably had a neutral to slightly positive effect. I mean, we were quite concerned. This time of last year, we, like probably every business in the world, was having crisis meetings saying, my God, what's going to happen? And our big concern, of course, was that, we would have everyone would just go to ground in terms of investing, that they'd be worried about losing their jobs, they'd be worried about economic meltdown, and no one was going to invest any further. And in reality, that happened for about 2 weeks, and then it all came roaring back. We have seen, we saw record levels of investment. We had a really good year last year. Probably would have had a better year, without the pandemic, but it was nonetheless a positive year. And I think that investors have weathered this storm well. And if anything, the general trend toward doing more stuff online, doing more stuff remotely, has perhaps made people more willing to think about investing online as well. It's been a more mixed bag, obviously, for our entrepreneurs and for our portfolio companies. Some have benefited massively. I mean, we've seen businesses. I mean, the one I always like to cite is the Cheeky Panda, which makes a high quality, more sustainable form of toilet paper, as well as other sort of household products. And you can imagine in March of last year, when there were runs on loo roll all over the country, how well they did out of it. A lot of other home delivery services, e-commerce businesses, and all have done great. Others have not done so well. We had a couple of really, really exciting young restaurant chains, that were doing great, had opened several locations, focused on city workers, focused on, the lunch trade during the day. And those were otherwise solid businesses, but they've gone bust as a result of this. And so while I think net, the portfolio is actually, in increasingly good shape, we've certainly seen a number of businesses suffer from the time. Moving on, we've got Greta from Twitter DM. Hi Jeff, great to see you on the show. Thank you very much. What would you say are the top 3 skills needed to be a successful entrepreneur? Well, first and foremost, it's a willingness to accept risk. I mean, it is, as a rough estimate, I'd say about 1 in 10 of the things I do succeed. Most of my day is taken up by failures. Most of my day is taken up, and my week and my month is, and from usually, hopefully, fairly small ones to occasionally quite significant ones. So everything from, spending an hour working on an initiative and getting to the end of it and circulating it around and being shot down for all sorts of reasons, that I hadn't thought of, to literally taking my entire management team to China for a week for a deal that I thought had a high prospect of going through, and getting absolutely nowhere. So, you spend a lot of time, and you have to, I think, be constitutionally built for a lot of rejection, a lot of failure. And sometimes the question, I mean, I'm American originally, I've lived here for many years, and then, consider myself a British today. But, looking back on my sort of two cultures, often the question about what differentiates American and British entrepreneurial cultures. And I think, frankly, in many ways, Brits make much better entrepreneurs. But the one exception is that, we're still a little bit behind in that sort of embrace of risk. And so I am, I'm a big believer in being able to be risk taking. I think everything after that, in terms of other skills needed, really depend on your business. Some businesses need a really steady hand that's able to guide through ups and downs. Others need a creative genius. I don't think there's a huge amount of uniformity. I think maybe, and maybe this goes slightly hand in hand with the risk point, but being a self-starter, obviously, you can't be waiting for other people to give you reviews. I mean, I now haven't had a review on my performance in anything for 15 years or something, and so, I just carry on with some degree of confidence that I'm not mucking it up too badly. But I think the answer is it's very business dependent, but risk taking and being a self starter is very important. Monique from Instagram DM says, "Morning, Jeff. I've been advised to use crowdfunding to validate my MVP. How should I go about it? Does this require a different type of campaign?" Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. It's probably a little bit complex of a question to answer here, and certainly I'd be happy to go into a little more detail offline. But I think that there is something to be said for putting a product out there, putting a business idea out there, and seeing if people will back it. I think it works probably better in product crowdfunding, but even within equity crowdfunding, there is a validation or a rejection, I suppose you would say, element to doing a campaign and seeing how it goes. But I do think that if you do equity crowdfunding, you want to be far enough along in your thinking as a business that you've really got a sort of story to sell. If it's still very, very preliminary days, I think at least equity crowdfunding can be challenging. I think product crowdfunding, Kickstarter sort of thing, can potentially be more effective. Next question is Lilavati. Again, apologies if I pronounced that wrong. From a Twitter DM. As an employer, what are the changes you've had to make to keep your employees motivated and productive during the various lockdowns and work from home requirements? I have 6 employees and doing what I can to keep people's spirits high, but it's not always easy. I couldn't agree more. I think this has been a real challenge. We have an amazing team. And I'm a believer in flexible working and remote working. I think a huge amount can be achieved and accomplished with people working at home. But not having that kind of cultural glue that comes together in the office is really very important. Or it is very important to have that sort of cultural glue. And we've been without it for a year. We've now got a bunch of employees I've never met in person, and it's been a challenge. We've done our best. We've done everything from sort of giving out Deliveroo coupons to people to have lunch with their teams. So, everybody orders Deliveroo at the same time. They have an online lunch. We've tried to do online quiz nights and things like that. We've done a lot more in the way of company meetings and huddles and all, so that we're constantly sort of seeing each other online. And we're also trying to alleviate some of the stress and burdens that people are facing, the isolation that people are facing. We just announced our own sort of Cedars bank holiday. So everyone will get to choose between 1 or 2 extra days to take off for free to just try to alleviate a bit of the stress. But, I think this is very hard. And I think, I'm the first to say I love not having to hop on the Northern Line here in London, every morning to get into the office. I'm very comfortable at home. But at the same time, I'm looking forward to the days when we're all back together in the office. Right. So I think that wraps up the questions. I now want to announce the poll results. They are in. We asked, have you ever sacrificed anything for your employees? And 100% said no. It was very interesting. Sacrifice is such an interesting word because, I think, there's a fine line between sacrifice and investment. I mean, I think that, most business owners, most business founders would say that they have done things, that if they had a sort of traditional job, they wouldn't have normally done, taken a lower salary, given more of their time, given more of their energy. But I think most of us would probably also say, that we don't necessarily see that as a sacrifice. We see it as part of what goes into building a business. So I'm sympathetic with that answer. I mean, I certainly feel like I've done a number of things through the years, not to pat myself on the back, but I've always been conscious of not taking, usually I don't think I've ever had the highest salary in the company, and often significantly lower than others. I've tried to take the view that it's my job to sort of, be at the vanguard when hard times come and all. But I think, I don't know that I see those as sacrifices. Those are probably investments as well. So very interesting result. Right. So I think that brings us to the end. Thank you all for tuning in. If you want to connect with me, you can send me a message on DM on LinkedIn. You can get me on Twitter, which is @JeffSeedrs. Search for me. I'm not the Jeff Lynn who was the frontman for ELO and the Traveling Wilburys. I'm very sorry about that. That would be cool, but I'm the other Jeff Lynn that's out there. Coming up on Ask the Expert on Monday is Alex Payne, who is an experienced television presenter and broadcaster, and the founder of The Room, a marketplace tech business connecting brands and people of influence. Tune in to get advice from the influencer of influencers. Don't forget to join the official Intuit QuickBooks SMB group on Facebook. Accountants and business experts are on hand 24/7. I'm Jeff Lynn. Thank you very much, and have a good day, everyone.